the Pro podcast by Merck. Interviews with people who think outside the box. A podcast about science and technology and how they can improve our lives.
Welcome to the new episode of the Pro podcast. I'm your host, Anna Sola. In today's episode, we'd like to share some of the content of the latest issue of Merck's Pro magazine. This is the purpose of this podcast, and I use the term purpose on purpose. The new edition of Pro is about the topic of purpose, that is, the meaning of one's own work. You may have heard the term purpose more often lately, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Companies are asked more and more frequently what they actually stand for. Via social media, customers can now contact almost anyone without any major hurdles, and they demand transparency. In addition, many customers are becoming critical. They don't want to buy from anyone who doesn't share their values. And that's exactly how employees feel too. They want to work in a place that shares their values. Merck has been pursuing its purpose for over 350 years. Today, the science and technology company has around 56,000 employees, researching and developing from medicines for major common diseases such as cancer to technologies that make everyday life easier. The Merck slogan, "We are curious minds dedicated to human progress," sums it up pretty well, I think. But people are naturally more vivid than slogans. In the current issue of Pro, you'll find some of their stories. For example, Dario Kolenko in Silicon Valley. He's a vegan and works for Merck in research on clean meat. That is, meat that comes from a laboratory. Or Ilhan Çelik, who works with colleagues around the world on precise therapy for lung cancer patients. To learn more about these people and their stories, I've invited Andreas Schmidt to join me on the podcast today. He belongs to the editorial team of Pro magazine, and he knows the stories behind the stories. Welcome to our podcast, Andreas.
Yeah, hi Anna. Great to be here. You mentioned the people and their stories, and it's true, we have many moving stories again this time in this issue on purpose.
Our first topic is about life and death, quite literally. Tell me about Priyabrata Patnaik. Who is he and what is his story?
Well, this Merck employee comes from a rural region in India, and he's currently doing research in Merck's life science division. And this region in India where he grew up was struck by malaria during every monsoon season. And so he experienced as a child how his peers had malaria, and some even, or many of them died. Once he told us that he saw 7 other children in the same hospital ward die, and he himself fell ill, I think 12 or 13 times even, of malaria, and he once even fell into a coma and was just rescued due to an experimental medicine that was given to him by a doctor who had asked his father for permission first. So today, Priyabrata works from Singapore in a test laboratory, and this laboratory checks medicines and vaccines before they enter the market. And his own childhood story is his daily motivation, so it's his purpose, so to speak.
So basically, he devoted his entire life and career to fighting malaria?
Yeah, you could say so, yes. He studied biology, and then he worked at the United Nations for 10 years, doing research in the fight against malaria and other tropical diseases. And then in 2006, he moved into private industry because he felt that there he could make a greater impact and a true difference in helping to fight tropical diseases. So he first joined Millipore Corporation, which was acquired by Merck in 2010. So now he's our colleague, and he works in the life science business sector. This business sector of Merck offers products and services that support other companies who work on developing and producing vaccines against infectious diseases.
So living in Germany, malaria isn't necessarily the first thing that I think about when I think about infectious diseases. Can you tell me how many people are affected here?
Well, you're right. In Germany, the problem is really not that imminent. There are around 1,000 people here that have malaria. But worldwide, of course, it's a huge problem. According to the World Health Organization, WHO, there are around 230 million cases of new infections with malaria every year. And in 2018 alone, there were around 400,000 people who died from malaria. The problem is that there really is no good or commercially available vaccine, although there have been development attempts since 1948. And Merck can support other companies here to really make a difference in this area, and that's what particularly motivates Priyabrata Patnaik.
Well, I'm really curious about his story, so let's have a listen.
The Survivor. As a child, he witnessed the death of other children his age and nearly died too. That is why Priyabrata Patnaik has been conducting work on a vaccine for decades. His search took him from the Indian jungle to the United Nations and then on to Merck. India, well known as the world's largest democracy, has been experiencing an upturn for years. The economy is growing, and many hope that the country will someday be a counterweight to neighbouring China. Yet India is a nation of contrasts. Outside the major metropolises, dire poverty still reigns. Hospitals, doctors and vaccines are in short supply. This is the world in which Priyabrata Patnaik has found his purpose. The story of Priyabrata Patnaik starts in a small town in the eastern Indian state of Orissa. The nearest school was 8 kilometres away. We had to cycle 4 kilometres just to buy some salt, Patnaik says as he recalls his childhood. Patnaik, today head of biologics operations for our life science business in Asia Pacific, comes from a middle-class family. His father was a scientist and his mother a teacher. Because his father worked for the government on rural development, the family moved to a small rural town in the jungle of Orissa. In addition to a lack of educational opportunities, infectious diseases were a big problem for the tribal population. In the 12 years we lived there, the local areas suffered with malaria during every monsoon season, Patnaik states. The tropical disease can manifest itself in many different ways. Sometimes it's only a bad fever. In extreme cases, it is fatal. This was often the case near Patnaik's rural town in the surrounding tribal villages, which lack proper medical care. The region, to which the family felt connected despite its adversities, was an ideal breeding ground for the disease. The region was hilly. During the rainy season, water accumulated in puddles where the mosquitoes reproduced. Deaths among children under the age of 5 were very common, he recalls. Patnaik was also infected 13 times, almost every year, and once fell into a coma. I only survived thanks to an experimental drug. A novel combination therapy helped him. Beforehand, the physicians asked Patnaik's father for permission to use it on his son. During his hospital stay, 7 other children in the same ward died. This dark period of his childhood unleashed a tremendous drive within Priyabrata Patnaik. These tragedies would not be in vain. His survival would have a purpose. That's when I decided I would aim to work in the healthcare sector. I wanted to help eradicate these kinds of diseases, he says. After studying biology, he worked for the United Nations for 10 years, conducting research on vaccines against malaria and dengue fever. Yet ultimately, he had to recognize that there was very little interest in commercializing these vaccines, also because they could not be produced at reasonably low cost. In their attempts to make the process more and more economical, Patnaik and his colleagues hit a roadblock. The number of adjustments you can make is limited, and we had made all of them. But this did not make him want to give up. If the number of adjustments are restricted, then new opportunities need to be found, he thought. That prompted Patnaik to move into private industry in 2006. First, he joined Millipore, which was then acquired by Merck in 2010. Today, he is head of a testing laboratory that inspects biotech drugs and vaccines prior to market launch. According to Patnaik, the reliability of the finished products is absolutely essential in order for everyone, even the biggest critics, to accept them. Apart from water purification systems, vaccines are the most important medical advance ever made, says Patnaik, who now lives and works in the ultra-modern city-state of Singapore. It's all the more important for us to eliminate any unjustified stigmatization of vaccines. The good news is that much has improved in the town where Patnaik once lay in a coma with malaria. While still working for the United Nations, Patnaik returned there in connection with a clinical study. I had the opportunity to talk to the people there about vaccines and their advantages, he says. 5 years later, and after his parents had already moved away, he visited his rural town and was deeply impressed by how much more modern it had become. Of course, this was not due to my return, but suddenly the infrastructure was far better than when I had lived there. Medical care had also made a giant leap forward. When I lived there, we only had one small hospital that has since been transformed into a fully fledged specialty hospital. Patnaik hopes that other regions of the world still suffering from poverty will soon develop similarly. People with treatable diseases are still dying. This should not be allowed to happen, he criticizes. Even though efficient malaria vaccines are still not available, local authorities could do a lot. For instance, so many people would not get sick at the same time if we could prevent waterlogging, thereby preventing mosquito breeding and transmission.